the bright May meadows of Shelmalier, a rebel hand set the heather blazing and brought the neighbours from far and near. Then Father Murphy from old Kilcormac spurred up the rocks with a warning cry. Arm, arm, he cried, for I've come to lead you in Ireland's freedom. We fight or die. He led us on against the coming soldiers and the cowardly yeomen. We put to flight. 'Twas at the Harrow, the boys of Wexford showed Bucky's regiment how men could fight. Look out for hirelings, King George of England, search every kingdom where breeds a slave. For Father Murphy from County Wexford sweeps o'er the land like a mighty wave. We took Molen and Enniscorthy and Wexford storming drove out the foes. 'Twas at Sneath-Quilcha our pikes were reeking with the crimson blood of the beaten yeoes. At Carbury and Ballyellis full many's a Hessian lay in its gore. Our Father Murphy had aid come o'er, the green flag floated from shore to shore. At Vinegar Hill, o'er the pleasant slaney, our heroes vainly stood back to back, while the Yeos at Tullow took Father Murphy and burnt his body upon the rack. God grant you glory, brave Father Murphy,
June the 21st, 1798, is a day which lives in the memory as a catastrophe for United Irish arms in orthodox field warfare. The Battle of Vinegar Hill was the last great set-piece field battle between two opposing armies in Irish history. Some have regarded it as a romantic last stand, as if the Wexford leadership favoured the prospect of offering open targets on a hill. In fact, the battlefield was chosen by the United Irish leadership, and it included the entire area around Enniscorthy town and the area around the slopes of Vinegar Hill. The United Irish leadership had confidence in the pikemen, who had proven their deadly efficiency within 4 weeks of combat. However, the military experience of the Crown Force generals and newly introduced artillery shells contributed in an overwhelming way to the massive territorial defeat of the United Irish insurgents. Was that then the end of the brave challenge in County Wexford to a powerful wartime army? In normal circumstances and logic, it should have been. However, extraordinary as it seems, a good percentage of the fighting United Irishmen escaped in good order, along with 80% of the leadership. Their determination to fight on, despite the havoc of the day, was remarkable. In the background was the expectation of French assistance. The endurance of these United Irish volunteers from the farmlands and streets of County Wexford is one of the proudest in a decade which saw infamy contrasted with unrivaled heroism. This is their story. Well, we are now 2.5 miles roughly south of Vinegar Hill, and after the military catastrophe and the retreat, there were strict instructions and logistic instructions given by General Lake, the Commander-in-Chief of the Crown Forces, to General Needham to completely seal off Vinegar Hill at this point in case there was a retreat. Of course, they always reckoned that there could have been a victory on the United Irish side as well. However, when the retreat was ordered from Vinegar Hill, when the situation was militarily hopeless, the United Irish Army discovered that in this area there was nothing happened. So they came down the east bank of the River Slaney, where we're standing now, and through this area here. In one of the military mysteries of the whole period, General Needham, a professional soldier, did not come here with his troops and therefore left a gap through which the United Irish forces, 80% of the leadership which had escaped, extraordinary to relate, the bulk of the fighting men therefore and 80% of the leaders managed to come down streaming through this area where there was little activity, and as a matter of fact, General Needham and his troops never turned up. The area to this day is called Needham's Gap, still a matter of conjecture by historians and people who cannot understand what exactly happened. But it enabled the United Irish Army to get to Wexford. They were helped by a rearguard action by General Edward Roach and Richard Monk, Monaghan, who appeared to cover off the retreat, and they made for both Wexford town and, as you will see at my rear here, the main camp outside Wexford town at the Three Rocks. I think it's at the same time it is fair to say that it did not pass without horrific incidents, because the major casualties, as in all wars, was amongst the civilian and refugee population trying to get pell-mell out of the awfulness of the total warfare that had been experienced that morning. By midday, the United Irish Army had come in retreat, fairly well intact, about 75% intact, right down to the Ferrycarrig Bridge across the Slaney. And having crossed the bridge, they divided once more into two divisions. One division under General Edward Roach, Edward Fitzgerald, and several others went into Wexford town, where eventually they crossed the Slaney again and up north towards Gorey and the Wicklow Hills. Father John Murphy and his group, that is the Ballyboughill and adjoining districts group, turned right when they crossed the Ferrycarrig Bridge, and they came to the major camp, one of the major permanent camps of the 1798 rebellion, here at what we call the Three Rocks, because of an outcrop of three rocks, but with a magnificent view and a tremendously valuable strategic position. Nevertheless, it must be borne in mind that the Crown forces were tightening in rapidly, and from this encampment, the forces who had won very narrowly the Battle of Hortown under General Sir John Moore were getting ever closer and ever closer. When Father John Murphy came here with his group to the Three Rocks, he found here the elected Commander-in-Chief of the United Irish Army in succession to Bagnall Harvey, Father Philip Roach, here, actually here in the Three Rocks camp. He was accompanied by his own men of his own contingent, and also the Wexford town contingent under Richard Monaghan, whom we call Dick Monk, and the John Street Corps. However, there was no sign of Miles Byrne, but that is a situation which resolved itself over the next 12 hours to his satisfaction. And after considering the situation, both strategic and their own personal welfare, it was determined, and it seemed that John Murphy was in charge of this determination, first of all to break out of the cordon of steel which the Crown forces were building very hurriedly all around him. And secondly, and this is where John Murphy's intelligence supply is quite remarkable, he determined, a man who previously, 6 weeks previously, had not been a United Irish commander or had not been involved in anything else except the proposition of peace, he decided that he was not going to surrender, he was not going to be outwitted, and that his intact army, as many as he could, good veteran fighting men, would break out of the cordon and make their way towards Kilkenny, the county Kilkenny, no matter how long and how hard it took, where he knew that in the village of Dunan, at the Castlecomer coal scene, that there were men in hiding, well armed and equipped, United Irish units with whom he intended to link up. So they left here later that evening for the woods of Slida, down underneath them on the main southern roads of County Wexford. Here in the woods of Slida, some of the greater human dramas and tragedies, glory and determination took place. This was the first halt in this, the safety of those woods, where John Murphy, Dick Monk and his men, who were numbering, I would suggest, between 2,000 and 3,000, with their followers, their wounded, their womenkind, halted in safety on the first halt from the ring of steel which was approaching Wexford. Now here was with them Commander-in-Chief Philip Roche, the man who undoubtedly and beyond argument, the newly elected Commander-in-Chief after New Ross, who succeeded Bagnall Harvey. And while he was here, an argument took place about strategy. But before the night was over, one other man who was missing returned from Wexford, having pursued Father John Murphy and his contingent without success in Wexford town, and he eventually went to the Three Rocks, that is, Miles Byrne of Monaseed. He went to the Three Rocks, discovered the direction Father John Murphy had taken, and he overtook that big group in the Sleda Woods sometime after dusk. So the scenes of jubilation when young Miles Byrne, who had already established such a fabulous reputation for himself as a fighting man, and were recorded in his memoirs, and it was, of course, a joyous occasion. Coming towards morning, there was a conference of chiefs, and the chiefs now here of this contingent were Father John Murphy, of course, Philip Roche, Father Philip Roche, the overall Commander-in-Chief, and Richard Monaghan or Dick Monk, in charge of the Wexford John Street Corps. That was the order of rank descent at that time. John Murphy was determined to carry on the warfare and certainly to escape from the trap of steel, and was certain that the rest of the country simply needed to see the United Irish Armies to join their ranks. Philip Roche, the Commander-in-Chief, was of a different opinion altogether, surprisingly. Father Philip Roche, who had been in the United Irish Organisation for years and who had been an organiser, and Father John Murphy, who was rather new to revolt, differed strongly on what was to be done. Father John Murphy wanted to carry on the fight with determination and with optimism. Father Philip Roche felt that he could get decent terms of surrender, or at least reconciliation, from General Gerard Lake, the Commander-in-Chief of the Crown Forces, and in this he was cruelly mistaken. That we know, of course, from the benefit of hindsight. But in any event, John Murphy and Philip Roche were resolutely opposed to one another, and John Murphy declared that he and his men, and they were supported by Miles Byrne and Dick Monk, would carry on towards the bitter end, if need be. And certainly they intended to take the large march up to the Scollop Gap and further on to join the Dunan miners in County Laois. Father Philip Roche left camp, rode back into Wexford, but as he left he turned around and asked John Murphy, "If I cannot get terms, where will I find you?" And John Murphy replied, in the last discussion they ever had, "You will have no difficulty finding us, because wherever we find slated buildings which can be of help to the enemy, we will burn them down." And at that they parted. Philip Roche to his brutal treatment and execution on Wexford Bridge, and John Murphy to one of the greatest epic marches in Irish history. Early in the morning of June the 22nd, the contingent that had now left with bursting hopes and good morale from the woods of Sleda passed across a terrible scene here at this place. It was here that the Battle of Goresbridge or Whoretown had extended over a wide area, and it's a battle that poor Father Philip Roche, the Commander-in-Chief of the United Irishmen, would have won had it not been for the exertions of one of the Crown Force's greatest soldiers, General Sir John Moore. But as the rebels, now completely under the overall command, in this division at least, of Father John Murphy, walked briskly across here, they came across a scene of what must have been to them terrible proportions. They had left the Battle of Vinegar Hill and all to that, and they were now accosted by a scene of desolation, of killed, wounded men, blood, carriages, horses, gun carriages, and so on like that. The bric-a-brac of war, of a tremendous battle, the unburied dead, the stench in the hot summer. This was a terrible stimulus to them to carry on and to fight while they were able. So it is at this point that their determination and the determination of Father John Murphy actually reaches the stage that, come what may, they were going to reach the Scollett Gap, the shelter of the mountains, in order to live to fight another day. But there was a very long day and tremendous dangers in front of them. Having left the battlefield of Hortown or Goresbridge, with optimism and good morale, the United Irish Army of Father John Murphy's division, now he is in command, with Miles Byrne and Richard Monaghan and their men, marched steadily on through Newbawn, through Old Ross, moving along then ever more steadily towards the Blackstair Mountains, and they reached eventually Rathnewer and Killan, where at Killan they had their first brush with yeoman cavalry patrols, who quickly and in fact retreated before the very formidable force of pikemen whose reputation had already been well established. They marched on then up towards Kilteely, with the mountains growing ever closer. And as they got to Kilteely, after a march of something like 40 miles plus, they crossed into the beauty and the comfort and solitude of the Scollett Gap. They marched through the Scollett Gap, and they marched through the gentle village of Rahana. At this stage they had now passed through the mountains, and they could see spread out before him the plains and the safety and security of County Carlow. At that stage also they were well aware, and how they were aware we are not quite certain, that at the village of Killedmond, which in 1798 was a substantial village with a military barracks, that at Killedmond there was installed, presumably to protect the Scollett Gap entrance from the Carlow side, there was a yeoman garrison and an infantry garrison which had been fortified with reinforcements. The reinforcements and the Killedmond garrison were well aware of the approach of the insurgents from the Wexford directions, and it was quite clear to Father John Murphy that even though they may be exhausted, even though they may have been on their last legs after almost a 50 miles march since the crack of dawn that very morning, that a battle to clear the way ahead was facing them. And so they attacked the garrison of Killedmond with the reinforcements right in front of them, and dismissed them after a brief, short, sharp and desperate engagement. The Wexford insurgents, exhausted or not, dismissed with losses the yeoman cavalry, the infantry and the reinforcements which had occupied their route through into County Carlow. Several yeomen were killed, and of course, as promised, Father John Murphy then set fire and burned the barracks totally and comprehensively to the ground. After which they moved outside the village to a hill where we are at the moment, looking at the wonderful view all round, a typical place that one might ascribe to John Murphy's wisdom, where he had a complete control of the approaches within sight of Borris, Killedmond, Rahana and indeed Mount Leinster itself and the Scollett Gap. And here they camped for the night of June the 22nd and for the morning of 23rd, before planning to take, capture and go through Goresbridge on the Kilkenny side of the border. John Murphy and the United Irish Command of his division were now made aware that Goresbridge on the Kilkenny side of the Barrow River, across a bridge, was very strongly defended, and it was necessary, if the insurgents were going to go straight through and into Kilkenny and up towards Castlecomer as planned, that this garrison be dislodged. Now, they didn't know it at the time, but it was going to present a rather painful, perhaps awkward and embarrassing situation, because the garrison in command in Goresbridge, apart from infantry and militia and dragoon reinforcements, was the Wexford town militia under the command of Captain James Boyd. And so John Murphy and his men, determined men, marched across the bridge into Goresbridge, into its main street, and there they were confronted by the garrison drawn up. However, with extreme of determination and aggressive movement, the insurgents came to grips with the militia and with the reinforcements and the yeomen, and after a sharp battle where most certainly the Wexford insurgents under Dick Monk would have recognised fellow townsmen, the battle was won against the Goresbridge defending garrison, and it was at this stage that the signal that the battle was over was given by the commander himself, not Boyd, but another captain, who leaped on the back of a charger, which was by another cavalryman, and galloped off completely from the scene, leaving the Wexford militia and the dragoons to their fate. So Goresbridge was captured. The militiamen and the dragoons were made prisoners of war and compelled to march with the insurgents under Father John Murphy, Miles Byrne and Dick Monk. But before they left Goresbridge, they packed up with every bit of supplies that they could muster in a very well-stocked little town. They repaired their weapons, they shod horses, and so reinforced and revitalised, they marched from Goresbridge until they came to Kellymount and the Bunreach, where their camp was divided somewhat into two. Now, at this stage, of course, between the Wexford militia and the Wexford town insurgents, there was growing animosity, which certainly had their origins back very likely in 1793, when the same Wexford militia had ambushed the crowd at Bettyville and outside John Street in Wexford, after the 56th Regiment had opened fire on the crowd in the infamous, what's known as the First Rebellion in July of 1793. And it was the Wexford militia under James Boyd which had ambushed the crowd, and the insurgents from Wexford town, and specifically and most significantly from John Street, would not have forgotten that dreadful day when over 80 civilians were killed in their intimate streets and nearby roads. So we can only assume that what happened that night in the camp at Kellymount was as a result of the memory of what had happened 6 years or 6 or 5 years previously. What happened was that 5 of the militiamen and 2 of the dragoons were killed by their former comrades in the militia, in the Wexford militia unit. Only for the presence of mind of Dick Monk, Richard Monaghan, who saved some of the prisoners who were about to be killed, more damage would have been done. He immediately sent for Father John Murphy, who was over at Bon Riach, and they came together. In the fuss and bustle of the time, they couldn't deal with the culprits as they would have wished, because they had to march fast and get underway immediately, because John Murphy's aim and object was to get to Dunan as soon as ever he possibly could. And as a hard taskmaster, he certainly, and a vigorous commander-in-chief, he did not allow any stopover for bureaucratic arrangements such as courts and rest periods. So as soon as possible, the men left, brought the rest with them as prisoners, and marched on across the intervening county towards the ultimate goal, Castlecomer and Dunan.
Following the attack on Goresbridge on the 23rd of June 1798, Father John Murphy and Miles Byrne left Goresbridge with their insurgents and camp followers and headed here for Bonree. It's about 10 miles from Goresbridge, and they set up their camp here in this field on that night. Early the following morning, about 2:30, they raised camp and headed for Dunan, where they expected several hundred colliers to join them in their campaign. Down in a townsland called Gorteen, Father John Murphy said mass for the insurgents and their followers. This is the roadway that the insurgents travelled in 1798 from Bonree to Dunan. This roadway subsequently became known as the Pike Road. The road was originally built in the early 1700s, and the idea was to facilitate the transport of coal from Dunan down to Loughlin Bridge and onto barges at the Barrow. From there it was transported down to Wexford. That was one of the main connections between the colliers and the Wexford people, and that's one of the reasons why Father Murphy had no hesitation coming up in this direction in 1798. Folklore from the area also tells us that as the pikemen came along this road, one of the pikemen piked a goose and put it in over a half door belonging to a Mrs. Ling in Critton and said to her, "Have that ready for us on the way back."
The mining area around Castlecomer was well garrisoned. Even in a village like Dunan, there was a barracks and a garrison with up to 400 of the Waterford militia stationed there. They were warned of the approach of the rebels, so at dawn the garrison was on standby, well equipped and in full readiness. But at the sight of the approaching insurgent column, they abandoned Dunan and retreated rapidly to Castlecomer. As Father Murphy, Miles Byrne, Richard Monaghan and their men came through Dunan, the colliers came out in their thousands to join them. They were prepared to go anywhere with them, fight anywhere, although they were badly armed. With high hopes, they set out for Castlecomer.
After taking Dunan, the Murphy-Byrne column moved along this roadway for their attack on Castlecomer. With them were the colliers that had joined them along the way. How many we don't know, perhaps a couple of hundred. As they got here to Massford Bridge, they decided to split their forces for their attack on Castlecomer, Father Murphy taking the Loon Road along the western bank of the Dunan, and Miles Byrne taking the old road into Castlecomer, attacking the town over the bridge.
At Castlecomer, Father Murphy decided on a ply to avoid battle. He sent a messenger with a white flag and a letter offering terms of surrender to Captain James Butler. When Butler recovered from the shock of this delivery, he opened fire on the messenger. The messenger returned fire immediately. Both of them missed. He was then pursued by the cavalry yeoman and shot dead in full view of his comrades, as happened at New Ross earlier on the 5th of June when Matthew Furlong had been shot. The raw fury of the insurgent army was to lead to the downfall of Castlecomer. Father Murphy led his men into the assault with a fervour and a drive which belied 5 continuous weeks of battles and marching.
Father Murphy attack on Castlecomer from the western end of the town was quite successful, and in a very short time they had most of the town in flames. However, Miles Byrne's position on the bridge was much more precarious. For over 3 hours they had been trying to take this building here behind me and dislodge the government forces who were well armed in the windows, particularly on the 3rd floor. After 3 to 4 hours, there were over 100 rebels dead on the bridge and a couple of hundred injured. At this stage, they decided, as General Askell was starting to bombard them from high ground over the town.
Father Murphy got his entire force together to give battle. They had some time to rest, eat and drink, as they had been in occupation of Castlecomer since 11 o'clock. It was now 2 o'clock in the afternoon as they marched out to take up their battle stations. Askell's troops were drawn up in formation little more than a musket fire away. To their astonishment, not a shot was fired at them by the King's troops. No attempt to outflank them, even when they were vulnerable getting to their stations. Then a sensational event took place. A red-coat soldier left his post and started to run towards the insurgents, bringing his equipment with him. It was a front-line desertion. Askell's troops opened fire on him, but he made it to the rebel lines. Then Askell and his well-equipped force unexpectedly abandoned the field and withdrew towards Kilkenny. Father Murphy decided to leave Castlecomer and head for Athy. No more time was lost. They left Castlecomer with the sun still high in the sky. Driven remorselessly, the tired insurgents took up the route through Moaning Row. Before Clonbrock, they crossed the Dean and into County Laois, that time known as Queen's County. They struggled on through Clonbrock, then Ferrymount, but it had become evident that the limit of human endurance was reached, and so it was decided to make camp on O'Keefe's Hill in the townsland of Slatlour in County Laois. They had marched close to 100 miles from Wexford in 3 days. When they left Slatlour, there was no one to bid them stay, wish them luck, or farewell. It was 1 month to the day since Father Murphy had emerged from clerical and rustic obscurity. The road was long and the day was hot. The insurgents trudged wearily on. Every step of the way was more tiring. They travelled back to Gorteen in North Kilkenny, through Crettenclough to the top of Old Loughlin Hill, where they turned south and continued until they reached Bonree. They halted here to rest. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, they moved off again to Kellymount, through the bogs of Annagar, onto Boherby, then Duninga. Near Paulstown, Father Murphy's mare gave up. A tenant farmer named Keogh gave him a fresh horse, on to Goresbridge. That night they camped on Kilkenny Hill. They had travelled at least 40 miles since they left Slatlower that morning.
All wars are tragic. War is a tragedy. And here on Kilkenny Hill, in the intimate surroundings where we can actually see a huge silent area of our homeland, it's very poignant to consider what happened here when on June the 26th, John Murphy and the United Army, now thoroughly disillusioned, although not thoroughly disillusioned, that was yet to come, returned here with, should I say, hands, arms and hopes empty. They had returned after the brilliant capture of Castlecomer. They had found when they got to Slatlower and that tremendous hill of vantage point that nobody was coming to help them. And there was only one alternative, and that was to go back to join their comrades in Wexford and in County Wicklow and carry on if need be until the French possibly would come before the end of the summer. And so here on Kilkenny Hill, Father John Murphy with Dick Monk and with Miles Byrne, his faithful and wonderful companion and comrade in arms, and all their surviving men, some of them utterly exhausted, but nevertheless with good hearts, rested here on Kilkenny Hill. And during the night, because of their exhaustion, they asked the new recruits, the Castlecomer miners from the village of Dunan, to stand guard while the Wexford contingent rested. It must be said at this stage, with the benefit of hindsight, that there had great differences of opinion and culture and background had arisen between the Wexford men and the miners. I suppose it could be said to be something of the difference of opinion and the difference of in culture between men from seafaring and country farm workers and farmers themselves, and say miners or factory workers, that there would be a difference of perception of the world. And certainly the Castlecomer miners, the Dunan miners, would have been said to themselves, we are following a hard taskmaster and we are going back and leaving our homes miles behind us and getting us back into Wexford and Wicklow for what? John Murphy was awakened for one of the most ghastly things in his life, because it was for John Murphy's information and knowledge and belief that they had marched into Castlecomer and Dunan. John Murphy was awakened to be told by his comrades in arms that during the night the Dunan colliers had left. They had taken everything they could lay their hands on that was shiftable. They had taken guns, they had taken what ammunition they could carry, and in the most humiliating development of all, of vindictiveness which was incredible, the gunpowder they could not take, they rendered absolutely useless. They pissed on it, every bit of it. This shattering blow to the morale and the hopes and even the belief in human nobility must have presented John Murphy with a ghastly situation and a ghastly turn of events. It is proper, however, at this stage to mention one man who was of enormous help to John Murphy during the length of the story that we've been unfolding to you in this area, and that is James Gallagher of Tomahurra, County Wexford, who was his aide-de-camp or helper or batman throughout this period. Without that brave man, there would have been an absolute chaos for John Murphy, particularly when he reached the stage of being a commander of an army in the field. And James Gallagher deserves tremendous credit for looking after him. Now, on the morning of June the 26th, when this debacle had taken place, reducing everybody to fury, anger, rage and humiliation, they attempted to, under John Murphy's orders, to go back to the Scollett Gap. However, the entire area here was covered with what can happen in a very hot summer, a dense mist with visibility extremely poor indeed. So when the insurgents, under John Murphy's orders, made their way back with Miles Byrne towards the Scollett Gap, John Murphy and his aide-de-camp, James Gallagher, were separated from them. And later on in the day, they decided to make their way independently of the main body up towards North Wexford, and eventually getting to the Wicklow Mountains, which was the predestined area where their colleagues and comrades of the previous week had been making for as well. At this stage, under General Charles Asgill, a military manoeuvre was taking place, and this gentleman, who wasn't too bothered with facts unless they suited himself, reported to his headquarters in Kilkenny a marvellous victory, that he had killed hundreds of rebels on and in and around the hill of Kilkenny, and indeed that they had killed the now famed and feared rebel general Father John Murphy. In fact, that what they killed in this area was at least 140 innocent bystanders, all aged, infirm and out with regard for sex or any other consideration. The Wexford men fought their way as best they could in the dim situation of fog that obtained, and fought their way back into the Wexford area, making northwards for the Wicklow Mountains, particularly under Miles Byrne. Sadly, Richard Monaghan, Dick Monk, whilst wounded, was captured at Bunclody by yeomen and killed on the spot. John Murphy left and took a rest from this point with his relatives, the Murphys, and still hoped for a better day.
In Wexford town, there was tremendous confusion, and the rebels were in no state to resist the sudden advance by the government forces to their west. The rebel rank and file was by now thronging the streets in search of food, and trying to make sense out of the disaster that had befallen their cause. Sir John Moore and his army reached the eastern slope of Fourth Mountain around this time. The Shelmaliers were still at Windmill Hill, and their outposts spotted Moore's men almost immediately and spread news of his appearance back into the town. There was, of course, no time to prepare a defence. Roach roused his men and led them down into the town, where he sought out several of the other northern officers, including Anthony Perry, Edward Fitzgerald and Garrett Byrne. They held a quick meeting at which the badly injured Esmond Kyan was also present, and agreed to rally as many of their units as they could and make a dash for the bridge and the open country beyond. Their hope was that, once out into Shelmalier and Ballykeen, they might have some chance of evading Lake's forces. Probably no more than half an hour after the meeting, Roach and Perry led several thousand men, the bulk of the old Northern Army, across the bridge. Now the rebel armies were in a good position, not only to evade Lake's net, but even to strike out into other parts of the country. Here at Peppard's Castle, the entire leadership cadre, consisting of Perry, Fitzgerald, Garrett Byrne and Edward Roach, were in one mind on the matter and resolved to march northwards the next day. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands of their rank and file disagreed, and these drifted away as the night passed. They had had enough of marching and campaigning and wanted to return home to their families. They were exhausted and disheartened, and decided, one at a time or even in entire battalions, that the best course of action was to trust in the government's mercy. The leading officers could do little about this, and some of those who chose to leave were quite prominent themselves, including John Hay, who slipped away and rode to Ballinkeel, a decision he surely would not have made had he known that Needham's men were already camped there. When the night ended, the effect of these withdrawals became apparent, and the army of 4,000 to 5,000 men that had escaped from Lake's clutches had been reduced to less than half that number. When morning came, the force at Peppard's Castle, although depleted by desertions, set out on its march to the mountains. They eventually came close to the districts where government atrocities were taking place, and at one point they found the bodies of several of the violated and murdered women on the roadside. They were just a few miles south of Gorey when this happened, and even though they had planned on skirting by the town and heading straight for the mountains, they now changed course and made straight for it. A group of yeomen spotted the rebel column as it approached the town along the Ballycanoe road, and a small detachment of troops went out to meet it. The rebels, however, drove them back before them, and in a matter of minutes the small garrison in the town panicked and began to flee out along the road to Arklow. Before they left, they took several prisoners out of the market house, and as they had done a month before, shot them on the side of the street. As they left, riding two to a horse in many cases, scores of loyalist refugees who had fled from the town and returned twice already during the rebellion also set out for Arklow to escape the rebels. A detachment of the rebel column gave chase to the fugitives as soon as it was realized they had slipped out of the town. The garrison itself got away safely and reached Arklow unscathed, but the incensed rebels caught up with many of the refugees near Coolgraney. They set upon them without mercy and massacred almost 50 of them in the village, some quite brutally. Then they returned to Gorey and rejoined the rest of the column on its march towards Croghan. The rest of the journey was uneventful. Perry and his fellow officers led the exhausted but determined men across the hills of northwest Wexford during the evening hours. And by nightfall they reached a place called the White Heaps at the foot of Crochan Mountain. They had marched over 20 miles and had removed themselves completely out of Lake's reach. In fact, Lake was still unaware of their existence as an organized force. The column that had camped at Crochan for the night remained there throughout the morning. The leaders were discussing strategy, and they found it difficult to agree on the details. Some wanted to remain where they were in order to give other detachments that had left Wexford town a chance to join them. There was particular concern about Father Kearns and his group, who were believed to have taken refuge in the woods to the west of Enniscorthy. Many of the Wexford officers argued vehemently that they should wait for a few days and give him a chance to catch up with them. Garrett Byrne and the Wicklow leaders, however, were less patient, and they advocated that the entire force should move further into the mountains right away and not wait for Kearns, at least not in that exposed place. In the end, Byrne's argument prevailed, and sometime in the evening, after they had killed some sheep on the nearby hills and eaten a meal of mutton, the first solid food many of them had had for 3 or 4 days, they broke camp and marched northwards down into the Ow Valley. They needed a supply of arms, and sometime during the afternoon they agreed to move westwards to get in position to attack Hackettstown on the following day. They began the attack on Hackettstown, on which they pinned so much hope early in the morning. The garrison, which consisted of about 200 soldiers, most of them infantry, had come to realize that an attack was imminent, and their commander drew them up in battle line to the east of the entrance as the rebels approached from the direction of Aughrim. The rebel officers split their forces into 3 detachments as they came close to the enemy line. One crossed the Derreen River, which ran parallel to the road and to its right, and moved around to the garrison's left. The other made its way across several fields to the rebel left and threatened the defenders' right, and a third drove straight ahead along the road. When the central detachment came close to the infantry along the road, they began a musketry duel with them. Many of the Kildare and Wicklow rebels, most notably Michael Dwyer and William Reynolds and their men, were especially prominent at this stage, perhaps because they still had some ammunition. And the rebel ranks seemed to have shown real determination in pushing forward in the face of the garrison's fire. The government cavalry began a retreat back into the town shortly after the battle began, and then fled out along the western road towards Clonmore. The infantry offered some resistance for a time, but eventually followed the example of the mounted units and pulled back into the town. They could not get cleanly away as the cavalry had done, and therefore had to take up defensive positions in the town itself. The rebels heavily outnumbered their enemies, but they had fewer firearms and once again had to attack fortified buildings without artillery and with little gunpowder. They threw themselves at the barracks almost as soon as they got inside the town, but were caught in the open square amid deadly musket fire, and many of them lost their lives in completely futile attempts to take the place by storm. In scenes remarkably like those played out at Castlecomer on the previous day, and at Borris 2 weeks before, they adopted every tactic they could think of to dislodge the soldiers, including that of advancing behind carts loaded with straw and mattresses. The bullets penetrated these, and none of the attackers could get close enough to the building to set its roof on fire. The efforts went on for hours, and scores of men died in the attempt, but all to no avail. And by midday they seemed no closer to taking the building than they had been when they first attacked it. Sometime in the afternoon, probably around 3 or 4 o'clock, the rebel officers called off the attack. Much of the town was in ruins by that time, since fires had caught hold on the streets of cabins. But the soldiers showed no signs of running out of ammunition, and the fires were having no effect on them. The rebels remained long enough to bury their dead, of which there were perhaps around 100, and then they retreated along the road on which they had arrived in the morning and made their way back into the South Wicklow hills. As soon as they had gone, the garrison left the barracks and made their way as quickly as they could towards Carlow, taking all of their equipment with them. The rebels had managed to drive them out of Hackettstown, therefore, but they had failed in their primary purpose, namely the acquisition of arms, and had lost many valuable men in the effort. Here on the Wexford-Wicklow border passed the 26th of June in relative tranquility. They remained in camp at the White Heaps throughout the morning and afternoon and were content to use the day to recuperate from the defeat at Hackettstown. Their numbers were even more seriously depleted at this stage, and the entire column barely exceeded 1,000 men. The rebel army at Crochan waited in vain for their commanders from the south for the third day in succession. Yet again the morning and afternoon passed without any sign that Father Kearns and his men or other units from the heart of County Wexford might join them. Further north, meantime, in the western districts of Wicklow, other columns were biding their time too, including the large one which had taken part in the attack on Hackettstown. Both groups evidently believed that there was still the chance of a French landing, and that they would not get any mercy from the government were they to surrender. Besides, given the nature of the terrain that they were now occupying, the chances of conducting a successful guerrilla campaign until the French did come must have seemed promising. They had agreed before nightfall that they would break camp and conduct a sudden attack on Carnew, 8 miles to the southwest the next day, to acquire fresh supplies of ammunition. At dawn, the entire force moved out. The route took them straight to the village of Monaseed. A local loyalist made a frantic ride into Gorey and warned Needham of what was happening. He called up about 200 cavalrymen, mostly members of the ancient Britons. They rode along the road towards Carnew, anxious to catch their enemies by surprise from behind. The rebels were not to be taken by surprise, however. Their scouts saw the cavalry approaching from the direction of Monaseed, when the main part of the column was in the townland of Ballyellis, about 2 miles from Carnew, the last townland before the Wicklow border. Warning of the imminent attack passed along the column quickly, and as soon as they realized what was about to happen, the rebel officers tried to organize a defensive action. There was a boggy field across the ditch to their left, and a high ditch to their right, between the two of which their men might be caught. Their only hope was to trap the cavalry in this vice instead, and to use the few minutes they had before the arrival of the cavalry to set up an ambush. The carts with the women and the wounded were near the front of the column, and they had these placed on 2 roads that branched off, one to the west and one to the south, just ahead of them. These would make do as barricades should the cavalry reach them. Then they had the main body of the column scramble across the high ditch and take up positions behind it. There was a bend in the road between the approaching cavalry and the rebels at this point, and the ancient Britons did not see what was taking place ahead of them. When they finally rounded the bend, the entire rebel force was already out of sight behind the ditch, and even the carts had been moved sufficiently far back along the Carnew road as to be invisible. As they came parallel to the ditch then, the mounted troops had no idea that hundreds of rebels, pikemen and gunsmen alike, lay in wait for them. The rebel musketeers opened fire when the soldiers were well inside the trap. The opening volleys devastated the troops and threw them into complete confusion. Moments later, the pike units swept across the ditch, some at a point opposite the soldiers, others further back along the road towards Monaseed. The gunmen and pikemen closest to the ancient Britons stormed into their ranks with fierce determination, while the group in their rear closed off any chance they had of escaping back in the direction in which they came. The soldiers had no chance. Many of them were pulled or shot from their horses and killed on the road. Others tried to escape across the ditch and into the boggy ground to the south of the road. Many of these did manage to get away, but rebel units gave chase and caught up with several of them before they could run very far. They showed them no mercy. A few of those who had been in the front ranks in the column got as far as the carts on the road to Carnew and succeeded in making their way around them and escaping to the town. Another group, consisting mainly of the various yeomanry corps that had been towards the rear of the column, never actually entered the rebel trap, but held back when the shooting started and remained at a distance throughout the fighting. The ancient Britons, however, were caught completely off guard by the insurgents. Around 50 or so of the ancient Britons died here. The chief objective of the march had, of course, been to attack Carnew. And so at around midday, with their resolve stiffened, they moved on towards the town. All hope of attacking the place by surprise was now gone. The noise of the battle itself would have been sufficient warning for the garrison, but the 3 or 4 soldiers who had escaped in that direction certainly confirmed for them that an attack was imminent. By the time the first rebel units appeared on the eastern outskirts of the town, the approximately 50 soldiers had already barricaded themselves into one of the few slated buildings left, a brewery which the insurgents had chosen not to destroy on the 8th of June. Dislodging them would be difficult now. The rebels opened an attack on the brewery almost as soon as they arrived in the town. The soldiers were well armed and in a good position, and so, just as the rebels had already done at Hackettstown, and just as their comrades had done at Castlecomer, they tried desperately to dislodge them by using loaded carts as cover. The effort went on for an hour or so, but yet again it ended in failure. The fire coming from the building was too concentrated and too deadly to allow the critical breakthrough, and after some time it became obvious that the task was hopeless. After about an hour they called off the attack, and Perry and the other officers led the column out of the town and made their way to the summit of Kilkenny Hill. They made a camp for the night there, just as they had done in rather different circumstances twice before, and waited for the morning before moving again. The efforts to replenish their arms had largely ended in failure, but they nevertheless had the satisfaction of inflicting a stinging defeat on their enemies, and their morale was undoubtedly raised for the first time in several days. On Monday, the 2nd of July, the rebel column at Kilkenny finally moved. They broke camp early in the day and marched westward across the Fitzwilliam estate towards the village of Shillelagh. The estate was in the heart of loyalist southwest Wicklow and was dotted with the large farmhouses of Fitzwilliam's middlemen. There is at least one claim that they captured several local loyalists on this march and put them to death. The allegation is not corroborated, but given the fierce loyalism of the area and the fearsome reputation of its yeomanry, it is quite likely that these killings did take place. The rebels saw no sign of government forces until they were just outside Shillelagh. Then they observed a column of yeoman cavalry and infantry, about 150 men in all, drawn up to oppose them. They continued to advance undaunted, and the cavalry fled as soon as they got close to them. The infantry held its ground. Rather than attack them directly, the rebel officers led their men off to the right and made for the slope of a hill called Ballyboughill, about a quarter of a mile away. The yeomen reacted slowly to the move and only tried to beat the rebels to the hill when they realised what was happening, but they were too late. Perry and his officers were already drawing up a battle line along the steep slope when they reached it. The yeomanry commanders were two local middlemen called Chamney and Nixon. They might have withdrawn to the village at this point and sent dispatches to Carnew or Tullow for reinforcements, but they chose instead to charge the rebel line. The rebels defended their position with musket fire once the soldiers got close to them, and then swept down the hill in a determined pike charge. The yeomen were driven back quickly and with great loss, perhaps dozens of men killed, among them the two captains. What was left of the force fled from the bottom of the hill to Captain Chamney's house, which lay nearby, and once inside they barricaded the doors and windows and made ready for a siege. The quick victory on the hill had no doubt yielded the rebels more arms and ammunition, and they might have withdrawn back towards the mountains with this prize and felt that the day had been well spent. However, the remnant of the yeomanry barricaded into Chamney's house was too tantalizing a target for them to ignore, and instead of moving back towards the east, they decided to try to dislodge them. And so, once again, as at Borris, Hackettstown and Carnew, they attacked a fortified slated house defended by well-armed soldiers. Predictably, their attempts to carry the building by frontal assault failed, in a hail of bullets which felled many of their best men. And predictably also, they then resorted to the use of mattresses and loaded carts as cover, and this only resulted in more needless deaths. The efforts went on for several hours and became especially destructive once evening fell. By that stage, a nearby house had caught fire, and this gave the defenders plenty of light to pick off their attackers from a distance. Eventually, with midnight approaching and their losses already substantial, Perry and his officers decided to call off the attack. When they had all their men in formation, they led them back eastwards, but rather than stopping for the night at Kilcavan, they pushed on all the way to Croghan, almost 10 miles away, and made camp at their familiar site, the White Heaps. The 3-day expedition to the west had yielded 2 victories in the open field, and some much-needed new weapons, but had been expensive in loss of life, and their inability to storm well-barricaded buildings was underlined forcefully. Here at Croghan, in the meantime, the rebel leaders had at last received reliable reports that Father Mogue Kearns and Thomas Cloney were holding out with some men in Clochram woods. They must have learned this from a straggler who had made his way to Croghan that day. They could have not have been certain that the report was true, but it was sufficient to prevent them from going on into the Wicklow mountains at this point. And Garrett Byrne and Edward Fitzgerald persuaded the other officers to let them take a small band of trusted men and to ride southwards during the coming night to find Kearns and Cloney. They were convinced that they could persuade both men to come and join them on the Wicklow border. As the day wore on, there were still no signs that any of the government forces in the region were moving against them, and they decided therefore that the camp would remain where it was until Fitzgerald and Byrne returned. At around twilight, the 2 men mounted good horses and set out in the gathering darkness on their journey south. Killochram was over 25 miles away, and so the risks involved in the mission were very great. Needham was putting the final touches to his plan to attack the rebel camp from 4 directions. As the 4 columns closed in on the White Heaps, the rebels were getting ready to move themselves. Shortly after midnight, Anthony Perry returned from Inch. Then, an hour or so later, and not long before dawn, Fitzgerald, Byrne and Father Kearns reached the camp. The entire North Wexford United Irish leadership, except for Fathers John and Michael Murphy, were now back together. In the dim dawn light as they greeted each other after a separation of 2 weeks, their resolution must have been strengthened. They had already agreed to delay their march into the safety of the mountains no longer. As soon as the daylight became brighter, they would make straight for the Wicklow Gap, 2 miles to their northwest, and from there they could move deep into the mountains. Once into that wild terrain, they would be very hard to tie down, and might survive for weeks or even months as a mobile light infantry force. In the midst of the handshakes and congratulations and pledges to fight on fiercely, they did not realize that even then the net was closing around them from all sides. When dawn did finally break on the 5th of July, there was a dense fog lying all across the broad valley around the white heaps. It had rained during the night, and now in the warmth of the summer morning, banks of mist were forming over the wet ground. The rebel officers got their camp moving quickly, and the entire force, consisting of about 1,000 men, set out through the mist across the rolling heathery hills towards the pass that led into Wicklow. They had marched about a mile through the fog when the morning silence was suddenly shattered by a deafening volley of musketry fired from directly in front of them. As it turned out, Duff's men had managed to range themselves directly across their route towards the Wicklow Gap. The soldiers did not expect to encounter the rebels at that point, and had actually fired the volley in panic when they heard the sound of marching men approaching them. The shots did little damage to the rebels, but they were undoubtedly as surprised by the encounter as Duff's men had been. And as they could not tell how large the government force ahead of them was, their officers wheeled them about and led them southwards and away from the danger. The sun came up as they marched south and began to burn off the fog. Once the air had cleared, Perry and the other officers could make out Duff's force behind them. But they could not at that time see any other government units and assumed that Duff was alone. Duff made no effort to catch up with them, however, even keeping his cavalry well back from their rearguard and merely following them steadily at a distance. Perry and his aides soon began to suspect that he was driving them into a trap, but they could not tell where it was set. In reality, of course, the rebels had inadvertently foiled Needham's original plan. At this point, Huntley and his men were already climbing to the top of Crochan, and once they reached the summit, they would realize that the rebels had departed. Needham and his group were moving towards the now abandoned camp at White Heaps, and they would not realize what was happening for some time. Lestrange was somewhere on the road between Camolan and Cranford. The main chance the rebels had of still escaping through the Wicklow Gap was to attack Duff and overwhelm him before the other sections of the net closed in on them. Sensing this, they turned round and tried to do so at a place called Ballygullen, 4 miles south of the White Heaps and about a mile north of Cranford. Ballygullen consisted of gently rolling fields and high hedgerows, and here the pikemen and handfuls of gunsmen might have a chance against the 1,000 troops that Duff could throw at them. Bands of rebel musketeers spread out along the high ditches on either side of the road, with pike units interspersed among them and behind them, and waited for Duff's men to attack them. In the circumstances, with Huntley, Needham and Lestrange still on their way, Duff might have held off and simply waited for the others to arrive. However, he may have realized that the plan had been upset somewhat by the fact that the rebels had left their camp. And at about this time, Needham was in fact trying to adjust his original strategy to account for this new development. And he may also have assumed that he was strong enough himself to break the rebels there and then. For whatever reason, the Limerick commander decided that he would seize the rebel gauntlet and attack before Needham and the others came up. The battle that ensued was short but fierce. Duff made the first move by sending his cavalry straight at the rebel lines. When they got within musket range, the rebel gunsmen opened fire with what ammunition they had left and brought several of them down. Those who succeeded in reaching the hedgerows where the pikemen were waiting were stopped and driven back with considerable loss. Chastened by this experience, Duff kept his mounted troops behind the lines for the rest of the struggle and relied instead on his infantry. As a result, a confused battle developed in the fields of Ballyboughill that involved several intense musketry exchanges interspersed with pike and bayonet charges by either side. Nobody could make the decisive breakthrough, however, and after about half an hour the fields on either side of the road were littered with dead and dying men. The failure to break the stalemate was especially disconcerting for the rebel leaders. And when news was relayed to them by their scouts that more government troops were approaching from the east and south, their situation suddenly began to look desperate. The rebel position was not completely hopeless at this stage. Because they had moved, they had unwittingly taken Huntly and the Highlanders out of the game. And instead of columns coming at them from all 4 points of the compass, they had only 3 to deal with. One to their north, one to their south, and one to the east. The rebel officers saw that their only hope was to slip through the gaps in the closing net before it was too late. They decided to split their column into 3 detachments, to evade the government troops separately, and to join forces again later on in the day and make their way across the border into Wicklow at some point to the west of their present position. There was little time to work out the finer details of the plan. With Duff still very close to them, one part of the column, which included Miles Byrne and his band, split off and made their way westwards towards the hills above Carnew. The remainder split into 2 detachments, and these proceeded southwards, both managing to slip past Lestrange and his men. Duff was himself confused about what was happening now. He may have known less about the whereabouts of Needham and Lestrange than the rebels did at this stage, and he held his ground as his enemy pulled back. Eventually, all 3 government columns met at Cranford, but by that time the rebels were well away. For reasons that are not quite clear, perhaps he wanted to wait for Huntly, Needham decided not to give chase, and so the 3 insurgent detachments made rapid progress, and in an hour or so were miles away from their erstwhile pursuers. Miles Byrne's group made their way safely into the hills around Carnew, while the other 2 pushed on southwards and rejoined each other by the time they reached Camolan, 3 miles away. They stopped in the village for a short while and happened to encounter the Anglican Dean of Ferns, a man named Brown, whom they took captive, perhaps thinking they might need a hostage. From there they marched on to their oldest campsite, Carrygrue Hill. And when they reached the summit and realized that they were not being followed, they released their prisoner. The rebel forces that gathered here on top of Carrygrue Hill probably numbered no more than about 1,000 men, if that. Most of the officers were with this detachment, and they now had to consider what their next step should be. After delaying their escape into the mountains for so long, many of them must have been bitterly disappointed that they had been foiled in the attempt and had been pushed back into the heart of North Wexford, where it seemed certain that they would eventually be surrounded and destroyed. Edward Fitzgerald, who seems to have wielded considerable authority among the men at this time, took the initiative at this point and addressed the ranks. He told them that they were free to scatter to their homes, but that anyone who wished to join him and the other leaders in a dash toward the mountain was welcome to do so. Some of the men, exhausted and demoralized, elected to abandon the cause and to return home. Nevertheless, in spite of the difficulties they so obviously faced, most of them made the decision to stay with their leaders and strike out for the mountains once again. The scouts who had been watching the surrounding countryside while these matters were being debated suddenly noticed a cavalry force approaching from the direction of Ferns. Dean Brown had alerted the garrison there, and now they were racing to the hill to cut them off. Many of those who had chosen to make for their homes had already made their way down the slopes of the hill, and many others now rushed down to escape before the soldiers came up. Fitzgerald and the other officers on their group rushed down the northern slope and past Donovan's house, their headquarters on the morning of Tubberneering, and fled out into the countryside beyond. The cavalry did not realise this, and the main body thus got away safely. A different fate was in store for the men who were trying to escape to their homes. The approaching soldiers spotted them as they came down the slopes and pursued them through the fields for much of the rest of the day. They showed no quarter when they caught up with any of them, and by the end of the day had killed many of them. Incredibly, Fitzgerald and his little column of dedicated men travelled the 10 miles or so to the Wicklow border without being caught. They reached their destination after dark, crossing the county boundary somewhere between Carnew and Croghan. In the meantime, the 3rd Detachment had remained in hiding in the hills near Carnew all day, waiting for the others to join them. Fitzgerald and his group did not know of their exact location, however, and stole quietly past them in the darkness without either group realizing the other was nearby. Miles Byrne's men realized what had happened well before dawn. His disappointment must have been great, but he and his men decided to follow them and to try to catch up with them during the night. Sometime before dawn on the 6th of July, therefore, the last rebel column slipped out of County Wexford. It was now exactly 40 days since bands of United Irishmen had first begun to mobilize, and now, with the departure of this group, the fighting inside the county itself was coming to an end. But while the rebellion in Wexford was now over, the Wexford United Irishmen were far from finally defeated.
The insurgent army at Carrigrew broke camp and set out for Wicklow, camping on the way in Ballymanus and on their way to Whelp Rock, which is near Blessington on the Downshire estate. At Whelp Rock, Captain McMahon and Rourke of the Dublin United Irishmen were present, as were Joseph Holt, Edward Fitzgerald of New Park, Captain Michael Murphy of Kildare, who had taken part in the attack on Naas 23rd of May 1798. It has been said that there were 10,000 men at Whelp Rock on this occasion. A short supply of powder and food was evident. 2 large containers for boiling meat were produced, and 79 head of cattle were consumed by the army. Father Kearns argued for a thrust into the Midlands to seize arms and munitions, maybe to meet up with the Antrim and Down United Irishmen. After much heated debate, his proposal was put to a vote, and he won by a small majority. On the night of the 8th of July 1798, the insurgents formed themselves into companies, and on the 9th of July 1798 marched into Kildare and Meath and history.
Having left their camp at Whelp Rock shortly before midnight on the previous night, the Wexford Army marched down through Kilcullen, across the plains of the Curragh, and arrived here at Robertstown in County Kildare on the following afternoon, 10th of July 1798. They marched across this bridge and on out towards Timohole, where the United Irishmen from County Kildare had their camp. Now their plan was very simple. They hoped to persuade the 1,500 Kildare men to march on with them and raise further support for the rebellion in the Midlands. At this stage, the Wexford Army, together with its Wicklow allies, would have numbered about 4,500 men. Some of them would have had guns, but the main bulk of the army were still reliant on pikes. Again, they were mostly on foot, although they would have had perhaps up to 1,000 horses with them. After they had negotiations with the Kildare men, they soon found that the Kildare army were not disposed to accept their plan of campaign. And it must be said that this was not because of any lack of courage on the part of the Kildare men, who had fought very well and bravely in the previous weeks. It simply was that the Kildare leadership felt that the rebellion was over, the game was up, they were in the process of suing for peace. And the Kildare leadership of Ware, Luby and particularly William Aylmer were not at all impressed by the plan put forward by Anthony Perry and Mogue Kearns. So the Wexford men marched on a few miles further down the road, and that night they established a camp at a place called Dreid. We're here at Clonard on the borders of County Kildare and County Meath, and in 1798 this road was the main coach road from Dublin to Mullingar, Athlone and the west. It turned into this field at that time and across a stone bridge over the Boyne. On the approaches at this side were a number of thatched cottages and a toll house, and across the river was a coaching inn which boasted that it provided good dry lodgings and breakfast. On this side of the bridge was a stout iron gate which could be locked to prevent access to the bridge. And one other feature here in 1798 was a strong stone building on my right owned by John Tyrrell. Very little remains of the house, just a few stone walls. But it's important to remember that in 1798 this house commanded the approaches to the bridge. And Thomas Tyrrell, the High Sheriff of Kildare, had this house fortified by building up the lower windows with masonry and the doors and part of the upper windows, and he left only slit openings for gunmen to fire through. He placed a permanent garrison in the house, and on the morning of the 11th of July 1798 there were about 40 men in the house. The male members of the Tyrrell family, 18 soldiers under a sergeant, and the Clonard yeomanry under Lieutenant Barlow. And at about 10 o'clock in the morning, Richard Allen of Ballinlig came riding down this road and into the house, shouting that the rebels were coming down the coach road. So preparations were made in the house to defend the bridge and defend the house from the Wexford Army. Now, the arrival of the Wexford Army here on that morning would appear to have been all in favour of the rebels. They had about 3,000 men, and there were only about 40 men in the house. But in actual fact, the opposite was exactly the case, because the men in the house were in a well-fortified house, but there was also a tower at the end of the out-farm buildings, which commanded the approaches to the bridge. It was directly facing the bridge, and he had 6 of his best gunmen in the tower. Now, when the battle started, a gentleman called Willie Farrell with the Wexford Army rode in through the main gate, and he was immediately shot by the younger Tyrrell, a 16-year-old Thomas Tyrrell. After that, the Wexford men attacked the building by making charges regularly, one after the other at the building, but without much success, because we must remember this was a strong stone building, and the Wexford men were armed only with light arms. Some had guns, but mainly they were armed with pikes, so they could make no have no effect whatsoever on the defenders of the building. They tried to get onto the bridge here, and several of them managed to do so, but they were immediately fired on by the people in the tower. and 10 of them were killed with the first fusillade. So they had to abandon the bridge because the gates were locked and they couldn't cross without taking the bridge and taking the house, of course, besides, first of all. They decided then to attack the tower and made several attempts to get into the tower, but again were fired on by the gunmen in commanding their approach. Eventually, however, they did succeed in getting into the tower, only to discover that there was no stairs. Access to the upper floors was by means of an opening in the ceiling, so they couldn't get up and were fired on by the gunmen above. Now, 27 Wexford men were killed in that tower trying to take it. Now, the battle went on for about 5 or 6 hours. Eventually, most of the thatched houses here caught fire, and there was a state of total conflagration about perhaps 5 o'clock when some reinforcements were seen arriving on the far side of the bridge. They were small in number, only about 22 or 3 men. But it happened at a time when the Wexford men had just decided that they couldn't take this building with the armaments they had, and were in the process of beginning to move away. Now, these reinforcements that arrived were mainly made up of the Kinnegad yeomanry, and as the Wexford men were leaving, they believed that they had in fact routed the Wexford Army, but this wasn't the case at all. The Wexford Army was in fact in the process of moving out anyhow. But afterwards they commemorated this great victory by having a jig written called the Kinnegad Slashers. This was a serious reverse for the Wexford Army. Even though they had fought very bravely in their attempt to take this house, in fact they had lost a great number of men. There were 160 Wexford men in all killed here at Clonard. Many of them are buried in the fields around here, some of them across at the old abbey. But 16 of them lie in this field here, and their names are on the memorial. It's an indication of how well armed the defenders of the Tyrrell House were, that it's recorded that each of the 40 defenders fired more than 100 rounds during the Battle of Clonard. This is the memorial to the 16 Wexford men buried here. We don't know where they came from in County Wexford, what parishes or townland they hailed from, but we have their names. Dowd, Kiernan, Rochford, Sinnott, Doyle, Redmond, Roach, Boland, Riley, Doran, Nolan, Murphy, McGrath, Hoare, Harper and Hogan. This is Carbury Hill. On the evening of July the 11th, 1798, after the Battle of Clonard, most of the insurgent army marched down and camped here. A number of them actually took over local houses and stayed there during the night, including Lord Harberton's residence, which is close by. And a claim was subsequently made for £68, 17 and 11 pence for damage done to the house by the insurgents and for drink consumed during the night. Now, here at Carbury Hill, some of the rebels went on the following day, but some of them decided to march back. Indeed, the Wicklow allies, most of them, marched back to Glenmalure from here the following day. And it was mainly Wexford men that went on from here into Meath. This is a memorial at Lollymore, County Kildare, to a man called John Durley. John was one of the Kildare men who marched on with the Wexford men and fought at the Battle of Clonard. He was captured while attempting to cross the Boyne, wading across it, and marched into Mullingar, where he was hanged. It was said that he was hanged so quickly that his clothes were still wet from crossing the Boyne. Now, one of the things about John is that his mother walked 40 miles, they said, seeking his body, but she was refused.
So on the morning of the 12th of July 1798, the rebels from Wexford, having left Carbury, moved northwards through the village of Johnstown Bridge, which is about 2 miles south of Enfield, and on to Enfield, which was then known as New Inn. They took the route out here as exists today. It was the same route then, and they took the route out here to what's known now here behind us as Knockderry, or now known as Renville Hill, but at the time it was known as Knockderry or Canuckfulla, and we think that from the local lore we think that possibly means the Hill of Blood. There are various reports as to how many rebels were here at the time. They arrived here around midday. Some reports, I think Colonel Goff of the government military says there were about 4,000 rebels here. We think that that's an exaggeration. A report from Joseph Holt, who was with them at the time, indicates that there were about 1,000 rebels, between 700 and 1,000. At midday, they set up here on this hill behind us. Possibly there was an overspill to the far side of the road, but mainly on this side here, they set up and they lit some campfires. They had 40 sheep killed and about 3 bullocks, and they commenced to make a meal for themselves. Now we know that they had sentries posted, and within a short period of time the sentries reported that there were government troops advancing on them. Colonel Goff was the leader of the militia, and as they approached, he dispersed his troops on this road here, which is just south of where I'm standing at the moment. And Captain Miller, who was head of the Dragoon Guards, he kind of posted them along here, and Goff himself took about 10 foot soldiers down to the southeast part of where we're looking across the field here, because he decided that it would be much better for troops on foot to assault the rebels from that particular point. Now the whole battle, if we want to call it a battle, lasted for a very short period of time. It probably lasted only about 20 minutes, but strangely enough, in that 20 minutes 150 rebels lost their lives and 2 of the militia. They were scattered to a huge degree north and east of this area from where we're standing. There were cornfields here at the time. They tried to hide in the cornfields. They were pursued and many of them butchered in the cornfields. Afterwards they dispersed in many different directions. Some of them ended up in North Meath, others went across towards Mullingar, which is west of where I'm standing at the moment. We know of one particular chap who was with them. He was John Durley. He was from Lullymore in County Kildare, and he had a girlfriend in a place which is west of here called Longwood, and he made his way in that direction. He swam the River Boyne to get to that point, and actually there's a bush over there to this day which is known as Durley's Bush. And although John Durley escaped on the day, he was later caught and hanged outside the jail in Mullingar. The battle, as I said, lasted for a very short period of time, just about 20 minutes. Some of the rebels here fled back to Wicklow, others went north to Meath and County Dublin, where they were later involved in other skirmishes. Renville, or Knockderry, as it was known as, has never got its rightful place in history, we reckon, until recently. We're just here about three miles, as the crow flies, south of here is what's known as Hackettstown Hill, and that's a well-documented battle where William Aylmer drew up his troops of about 1,500, and about 200 of those were killed on the 19th of June 1798. So if you look in terms of Hackettstown and you look in terms of Knockderry, there's only a difference of about 50 people in terms of who died and who didn't die. So in that sense, this place we find is every bit as important.
After the Wexford men left Renville, of course they left in a bit of disarray. They were very tired, very footsore, weary, but they decided to move on towards Cross. And after leaving Cross, tradition tells us, they moved across towards the Bullring, skirting the village of Summerhill. They reassembled at the Bullring and then moved down across the County Meath River and moved on towards Hackettstown. Before moved up the lane at Hackettstown, there were a number of them actually took refuge in sheds there in Hackettstown, and tradition has it that there were up to 20 or 30 of them killed in that shed. Afterwards they moved on up towards Laois up in Culmullen, and of course we know the history of what happened above in Culmullen.
Tonight we're here again recounting the 1798 involvement of Culmullen. We've marked about 20 graves for all the Wexford men and women who were slain in the area. It stretches from an area just outside Trim to Dunboyne and follows an old course of roads. The fact that Lord Fingal was here in the locality obviously mounted troops, militia, whatever. They were obviously able to come and counter these insurgents, or these Wexford men who came through the area, which accounts for most of the graves here in this locality. The people were very, very proud to be associated with this, and we're also very proud to be invited back to Wexford to unveil a monument down in Wexford to the Wexford men who died here in County Meath.
It was late on a Thursday afternoon of July 12th, 1798, that the Wexford Army marched through Culmullen here in County Meath. Earlier that morning, they had been surprised when making camp a few miles away at Knockderry, and after a short, sharp battle had lost a number of men and most of their supplies. It can be truly said that Knockderry was the first time since the Battle of Owlert Hill more than 6 weeks earlier that the Wexford men did not give a good account of themselves. Amongst the army marching through here that afternoon were surely men who had fought at the Battle of Owlert Hill, men who had charged with pikes over open ground and taken Walpole's artillery at Tuberneering. There were men who had fought for hours in the heat of Ross, men who had fought at Vinegar Hill or battled at Arklow, men who had fought at Horetown or at Ballyshannon Lane. For this was the remnant of an army that had fought 19 major battles against well-armed, well-trained troops, and had been successful in many of them. But they were tired now. Many of the men had been in the open for a number of weeks, sleeping when they could and where they could, eating what they could get, constantly marching and constantly fighting. And contemporary reports tell us that the army that marched through Culmullen here that afternoon had all the appearance of weariness. As they came towards Culmullen, indeed, stragglers were being lost off the end of the army who could not keep up. They were being captured and killed. Though they could not have known it then, of course, the army that came through Culmullen here had many more miles to march and more battles to fight before their final battle at Ballyboughill, County Dublin.
This is the bridge here at Hackettstown. Now, on the morning of the 13th of July, some rebels were disturbed in the barn in Laois, which is up the fields here on my left. Now, there was 3 rebels under the bridge here. They were disturbed. They were executed roughly here and buried inside over this hedge here in 3 graves, along with some others. We're not sure exactly of the numbers here, but these are definitely Wexford men. There's no question or doubt that these were Wexford men. And there's also on our 200 yards up the road here, we have another grave, possibly a man who fell into the ditch, remained in the ditch. He definitely was there. People saw him there 2 or 3 days later, and eventually the locals came along and covered his body up. And this really is the start of Culmullen's involvement, and this involvement in the Wexford men. They had come from Renvoyle, or Knockderry, having been surprised in the morning, had come through Rathmalline, Summerhill, Arrottstown, and were hiding in the barn, Lawless's barn, which I'll show you later, the site of, when they were disturbed. These fields around here were covered in growing of maize and barley and wheat at the time. As it was July, the crops were ripening. These would have been the older type crops, which are probably grown to roughly 6 foot in height. And the rebels were hiding in all these fields, and some for 3 or 4 days. And if you look at the map and the distribution of the grave sites in this area, you'll find that they fanned out from roughly around here. We have graves in practically every second field around here. This is the big tree at Hackettstown. Circumference of the base here is 36 feet. It was on this on the morning of the 13th of July. Some rebels, having been disturbed in Lawless's barn in front of me here, were taken out here and hung on this tree. Now this is without a doubt, this tree is the hanging tree of Hackettstown. Every time the land was sold around here, it was sold on one condition, that the big tree at Hackettstown would not be touched. Now about 100 years ago, Lawless's barn and possibly the farmhouse was still extant, but had fallen into disrepair, and the barn itself was being dismantled. Probably a wooden structure over, it's hard to know what type of structure it was, possibly wooden. But on the morning that it was being dismantled, a stranger appeared in the area and came to the workers who were taking down that barn, and he said, pointed to the tree here and said, that's the big tree at Hackettstown where the rebels were hanged. Now this man was, by his accent, was a Wexford man. And he came out here and he chopped off a piece of a branch and took it away. And I say, here we are, we're looking at it here this evening. It's not hard to imagine what happened here in the morning. Men screaming, hanged from trees, their bodies thrown into bushes around here to rot. And we now look at it today, it's still 200 years later. It springs new life every year, perhaps new life for what the men who were hanged here died for.
Well, here we are at the banks of the Byrne, as you can see, at a place called Rossnery that is historical. But the main reason we're here this morning is that after the Wexford men broke camp halfway between here and Laois, they have come up along the river and this here, 200 years ago, was very wide on account of the fact that there was no weir built here for 50 or 60 years afterwards. So there's known here from local knowledge that they actually forded the river here, and where you're standing here now is in South Meath, and when you cross the river you're into North Meath. And from there on we continue towards Slane. So you'll be crossing from South Meath into North Meath here at this point. The army were camped in a position between both roads, protecting both the Navan Road and the Kells Road, where the Wexford men intended to go the Kells Road through Wilkinstown. So they were actually diverted here by a sustained attack, and they then diverted towards Kilkenny. Now we're here on the fringes of where the main battle took place, and we're overlooking an area of low ground first, then high ground to the background where the rebels took up position, and higher ground where the cannon and enemy forces actually fired on them. And by possibly moving and dispersion in time and scattering out, they saved vast losses, because when the cannon arrived they had no other choice only to despair. So foot soldiers dispersed of the Wexford men in every direction, but the horse soldiers went towards the northeast, which is directly away from you where you're standing now.
The story of the Pollock family began in Mountainstown in 1796, where the first John Pollock, who was a solicitor and attorney in a practice in Jervis Street in Dublin, bought Mountainstown from a Miss Anne Gibbons, who was an only daughter of Samuel Gibbons, who bought the house in 1727 as a dowry for his daughter. The family have been here father to son, and I only discovered a few years ago that my husband's ancestors had been involved in the involved in the rising of 1798. And also I discovered that one of my ancestors was involved. So I became very interested and started studying the history, and discovered that there were a lot of Wexford croppies who had fallen at Mountainstown, Bog, Knightstown, and all around this area. So I felt that as it was coming up to the bicentenary, we'd have an interdenominational service of reconciliation on the hill where the old Kells RD road used to go, and where we knew from tradition and also written history that there were a lot of croppies buried after the Battle of Knightstown Bog. So we organised with a committee, a very supportive committee from around the neighbourhood. We organised an interdenominational service on the hill. 400 people came, and all the clergy you can think of, both bishops of Meath, Presbyterians, Methodists and Baptists, and we had a service in memory of the dead of Wexford. burial cross on Arthur's Hill, which is the site of where a lot of croppies were buried, as the old Kells RD road used to stretch from the bottom of the hill, over the hill and down the other side. And we decided that this was an ideal spot with a wonderful view all around the countryside, right down to Knightstown Bog, right down to Carbury. And with the help of a very wonderful committee and with hundreds of local people, we raised money to erect this beautiful cross. We raised all the money ourselves. And this is the place where 200 Wexford men came, and we had a little ceremony here. The cross symbolises on this side the Tree of Life and Tree of Liberty, and the texts are written on a plaque on the side. It says Interdenominational Service of Reconciliation, 4th of July 1998, in memory of the unknown United Irishmen of Wexford and others who fell following the Battle of Knightstown on the 14th of July 1798 and buried here and surrounding Drakestown and Mountainstown. This cross is a gift from all who supported this service. I chose this design, which my daughter-in-law Atalanta actually executed. The idea is that the Wexford croppies here were hundreds of miles away from home, and they fell unknown, unshriven, and it reminded me of the text from the Bible. Jesus said, "The fox has his hole and the bird has his nest, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Symbolic of the plight of the croppies. The east side of the cross shows a symbol of the United Irishman's banner with a pike and a harp, and under it is written Erin go Bra. The text is taken from a hymn by Bishop George Doan, 1799 to 1859, and one of the verses, very appropriate, I thought. "Fling out the banner, let it float, skyward and seaward, high and wide, our glory only in the cross, our only hope the crucified." Following on the story from the Battle of Knightstown Bog, Father Thomas Murphy, supposed to be the brother of Father Michael Murphy, who died in action in the Battle of Arklow, was wounded, mortally wounded, by yeomanry, one of whom was Thomas Corbally, and one was Gordon Jackson, and one was a man called Kellett. He was mortally wounded. Now, he lay his head on this little wall of this little stream, and he died of his wounds. The stone that originally was here was supposed to ooze his blood every now and then. Obviously the blood soaked into the stone, and when the weather was right, I'm sure scientifically it's quite possible. We put up this plaque last year in his memory. Here Father Thomas Murphy died of his wounds during Battle of Knightstown Bog, 14th of July 1798. The story was that he would only allow a Catholic to kill him. He said, "No one but my own religion can kill me," because he was catching the musket balls and throwing them back. And so this Thomas Corbally, who was a Catholic, he said, I will do the deed." And this is how the myth and the story and the facts have all got confused. We don't know what is true and what isn't true. But it is known that musket balls, if they were misfired and fired at the wrong trajectory, could be caught and thrown back.
After the Battle of Knightstown Bog, the rebel army scattered in all directions. A small group consisting of some 16 Wexford men and 2 Westmeath men went southwards. These men were ambushed at a place called Girley Grove, near Fordstown. There was only one survivor, a man named Jim Kelly. He lived in Archerstown for 50 years after and is buried there.
So, the Wexford men could take no more of it. There was the pitch cap fire, and triangles. Nowadays, there a few years ago, we heard when Nelson Mandela was in Africa how to throw a blazing tire in on the poor unfortunate people. Well, what was done with the cruppies? There was a pot of boiling tar spilled over their heads, and it was just the same as the blazing tire over the people of South Africa. But we were 200 years before that, so we were the Irish people, and you talk about human rights and civil rights, yeah. So with that, the Wexford men said they had enough of this, and Father Murphy lit the fire in the bog and he called the people together. That's the only way they had of getting the people to assemble. There was no bush telegraph, or there was no phones, or there was nothing. So they fought in Wexford. But then, of course, help was to come, but help never came. And they thought they'd get to their friends up in the north, up in the County Down. And they couldn't go up along the coast up by Dublin. There was a garrison in Dublin. So they said they'd come out into Wicklow, into Kildare, cross the Byrne, come through Meath, and get around that way to County Loud and on to the County Down.
This stone here is to commemorate the burial place of those who lost their life in the Battle of Gerley Grove, or Fordstown as it's known. The British seem to put it down as a battle, or the officer in his report, but it was more an ambush and murder. So they are buried on the hill. The graves were discovered about 40 years ago by some county council workers, and this was a quarry at the time where they were taking out gravel, and there was a local man went in to get the loan of a barrow full of gravel, and himself and the county councilman went to the right of the pit and found the bodies. So as you can see, the main vein of gravel, which would be over my left shoulder, was never touched. The quarry down into the right, because nobody would ever touch the hill after that where they're buried. So we have this stone here to commemorate the burial place.
After the Battle of Knightstown Bog, the two principal leaders, Father Mogue Kearns and Colonel Anthony Perry, managed to make good their escape and stayed together. They rode down through County Westmeath, and they stayed at least one night in the village of Balnagore. They had to leave there fairly hurriedly because their presence was discovered. And we know that on the night of the 17th, they stayed with a family called Lynham in the townland of Ballinowlert North in County Offaly. On the following day, on July 18th, 1798, we know they were here in the village of Clonard because they visited a forge which was down here to my left, run by the brothers Flynn. And they were being hunted by the local magistrate, Ridgway, who arrived here sometime around 11 or 12 o'clock in the morning with a party of 16 riders. He asked the Flynns had they seen Kearns and Perry, and they denied it. So they turned and rode out here, heading for the road towards Rathangan. As they went around the corner here towards Rathangan, a man called Hume, standing in the doorway of a house, shouted to them. They went the other way. So Ridgway and his party turned and headed back out the road towards Bracknell. Kearns and Perry, for some reason, when they left the forge that morning, were on foot. They didn't bring their horses with them. We don't know why. It may be that they left in a hurry and had to leave the horses behind, or it's possible indeed that they thought they might make their escape better on foot by being able to hide perhaps in the woods and bogs around here. But they had only reached a point about 1 mile outside Clonard when Ridgway and his party arrived and captured them at a place called Wheelabout. They were put under arrest by Ridgway and marched into Edenderry. Colonel Anthony Perry and Father Mogue Kearns were marched into Edenderry by Ridgway. He put them on trial at a court over which he himself presided, and needless to say he found them both guilty and sentenced to death. On the following Saturday morning, July 21st, 1798, he brought them to a place called Blundell's Wood, overlooking the town of Edenderry, and from an oak tree he hanged them both. There was a very large crowd there to see them being hanged. Now, there's a street in Edenderry called after Father Mogue Kearns and another after Colonel Anthony Perry. They were both buried here at Monasteroris Cemetery. And ironically, the man who hanged them, Ridgway, is buried just a few yards away from them. One other little point of interest. Ridgway managed to find the horse which was left somewhere by Kearns, and he kept him for himself, and he always referred to the horse as Kearns.
The rebels, when they broke away, eventually all linked together, particularly the horsemen, and they come back up this road. And as the Wexford men passed here, they went down this road back towards Slane on their way back to Ballyboughill.
On behalf of Camorra Meath, I'd like to welcome you all here today, particularly Senator Bill Murray and other special guests we have. I welcome you to Creewood, Creve Dubba, in the parish of Grangegeeth, which means the farm of the monks. This land is the barony of Slane, whose ancient name was Ferta Fairfake, the graves of the men of Fake, who was the son of King Lear. But it was another king that caused us to be here today. It was that tyrant George III, the cause of all our problems. We are not here today to honour kings or talk about kings. We're here to honour the men of 98 who were slaughtered in Knightstown Bog. And whilst some of the men were making their way, trying to make their way back towards Wexford, and they came down this old Derry road. And one man that was wounded in Knightstown was taken off the back of the horse and laid on the side of the road and was buried here on this very spot, now where we stand today. Now, tradition has it that there are other properties buried very close to this, but this is the one that's really well known in the area. And I'm going to give you to Noel Curtis for a couple of minutes, because Noel is the man that was educated across the road here, the local university at the time, and he knows all the facts from some of the old characters that are not gone, not many years ago. So let Noel have a quick word.
Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen from Wexford. We're glad to have you up here today, and I'll give you a few of the wee details. We're on the ground here of Jackie and Tony Wall, and it was one of their old ancestors that told the story directly, that come from his granduncle when I was going to school over here across the road. I suppose I was about 12 at the time and didn't realise that, looking back now, there's already a quarter of that time gone. And it's only now when you count back, it's not all that long ago, because that man was 90 years of age when he died, and his granduncles could be even in the late teens in 1798. And the men of Wexford just went south of here when they were going to battle, just a half a mile across here behind our backs. And after the Battle of Knightstown, the cavalrymen broke away northeast, and they come in bunches down this road. And as Joe Riley related it to me, he said some of the last of the bunches of men that come down the road had wounded among them. One particular man, very seriously wounded, was taken off a horse and died a very short time later. And that's that man that is here at our backs today.
Ladies and gentlemen, pikemen and women from Wexford, I'm delighted to see you here today for the unveiling of this stone. The reason that this site is chosen is that this is the townland of the Murrah, and this is where the first group of Wexford men, in that group that split off after the Battle of Knightstown Bog, fought. There was an engagement here, and the men who fought at this site and fell at this site were buried in the fields here. Late in the evening in July 1798, on the 14th of July, the last of the Wexford column came here to this spot on horse. They were the last of a brave remnant that had fought at Knightstown Bog earlier in the day, and the foot soldiers had made their own separate way back down through County Meath. The men on horse opted to come this direction into North County Dublin. They fought a short rearguard action back here in a place called the Murrah, and there was a running fight, it would seem, back to Drishog Lane. They arrayed themselves as well as they could. What little musket and shot they had, they used there at that spot up past the cross here at Drishogue. Esmond Kyan was the leader of the group at this stage. And by all accounts, Kyan shouted to his men, seeing that the situation had now become totally hopeless. It's every man for himself. And with that, the group scattered in all directions. Now, the Crown forces, who were in very hot pursuit, gave no quarter. And in the words of Lord Carhampton, he said, anybody found in a brown coat was butchered without discrimination. The hunt and the chase lasted for maybe a radius of 5 miles, but a lot of the men found refuge in Ballyboughill, Dunan, and further back, because there was still a very active band of resistance in this area led by the local United man Joseph Weston. That basically was it. We know the names of some of the men who got sanctuary here. There were Sinnets and Colfers and O'Walsh. Some of them were captured a long time after July, in the winter of 1798. But many managed to make it back. Of the 450 who came here, up to 200 were killed, most of whom are buried in the graveyard in Ballyboughill. The remainder, as far as we can make out, made a good escape. Many of them eventually found employment on the farms and in the cotton and linen industry in and around Balbriggan, and stayed and settled here. But the memory of 1798 and the Wexford men's last stand was always proudly remembered. There was an eyewitness account to the fate of one of the rebels as he tried to make good his escape. About half a mile up Drishogue Lane, a little girl by the name of Hagan was returning from Ballyboughill, and on hearing the noise of the action, she jumped into the nearest ditch, and looking out, she saw a pikeman running across one of the small fields that's still undeveloped up here, being pursued by 2 men on horse. When he saw that he couldn't get any further, couldn't make good his escape, he turned and presented his pike to them. At that, the soldiers stopped, because rather than face him, they drew their pistols and shot him. And that was an eyewitness to 98. Well, this stone was erected here last year on the 12th of July to commemorate the bicentenary, and it was unveiled by Bill Murray for the Carrickburn Pike Group in Wexford. There's a verse on the stone, and it's a verse taken from a centenary ode written by William Rooney, who was one of the great Irish patriots of the late 19th century. And it just says, "Tell to the nations, though the grass is o'er them for many a weary year, our father souls still thrill the land that bore them, their spirit still is here." And that they were just thought to be fitting words in memory of the men who lie buried here.
And so in Ballyboughill ended the dreams, the hopes and the aspirations of those brave men and women who refused to surrender and left Wexford on an epic 500-mile journey that was to be one of the most tragic ever recorded in history. It is our sacred duty to strive to uphold the ideals for which they died.
Feel the patriot's fate, who hangs his head for shame. He's all in name, or half a slave, who slights his country thus. But a true man, like you, man, will fill your glass with us. Who fears to speak of 98, who blushes at the name, when cowards mock the patriot's fate, who hangs his head for shame. He's all a knave, or half a slave, who slights his country thus. But the true man, like you, man, will fill your glass with us. We drink the memory of the brave, the faithful and the few. Some lie far off beyond the wave, some sleep in Ireland too. All are gone, but still lives on the fame of those who died. All true men like you.